All right. We are studying in the book of Esther. We're studying the characters of Esther and Mordecai. And our plan for this evening is to finish Esther, get started on Mordecai, and then finish Mordecai next week. We've been discussing kind of some of the background. In fact, that's part of the reason why we're reading through a lot of the book of Esther. We may not end up reading through all of it, but we're reading through some of it just to kind of get some of the background context. King Ahasuerus, also known as what king? Xerxes the First. Okay, that's his Greek name is Xerxes the First. He was well known, and he's even well known outside of the Bible in archaeology and history and so forth. And he reigned for about 20 years or so, and during this period of time, and of course, please make sure you correct on your notes, and I don't know why I put Assyrian captivity. It should be Babylonian captivity. But around this time, Malachi and Ezra will be coming on the scene in about 10 or 15 years or so. And of course, they are going to be key components in both not only in prophecy, but also in the teaching of God's word as Judah is allowed back to Jerusalem, along with the rebuilding of the walls and so forth. So that kind of is a little bit of background there. Also, I was reading Zondervan's commentary, and he mentioned that recently the word Puru has been found inscribed on a dice from this time period, confirming what the writer says about the origin of Purim, which, as we're going to see at the end of the book of Esther, the Feast of Purim, or the celebration of Purim, is kind of the remembrance of the Jews being delivered by God, obviously, ultimately, but also through the work of Mordecai and Esther from the enemies of the Jews, including Haman. And I thought that was really interesting because we've been talking about how archaeology kind of works to support the claims of the Bible and the historicity of what the Bible says happened. And I thought that was really interesting because sometimes that kind of throws you off a little bit. Also, if you happen to talk to somebody, I didn't know this before, if you happen to talk to somebody about the book of Esther, and they start mentioning to you verses that you do not recognize, it is likely that that individual is Catholic. Apparently, the Catholic Bible has Greek additions to the book of Esther. About 107 verses were added later by Catholic scribes in the Greek Septuagint to include references to God and so forth. The same is true with the Psalms. I studied with somebody a long time ago. I was pretty young. I was a teenager, but I was studying with a next door neighbor who was also a teenager, and they quoted from Psalm 150 something or other, and I'm like, what? And I didn't have those Psalms in my Bible, and I looked at hers, and they were there, but it was a Catholic Bible. They have some additional things that were written well later, well after some of these other well-known and inspired writings and so forth. So just kind of be aware of that, especially if you're studying with somebody who is using a Catholic Bible or is of Catholic background. Kind of be aware of that. All right, so we discussed last Wednesday night up through chapter 3 of Esther. We noticed how Haman he's not a fan of Mordecai. Mordecai won't bow down to him. And as a result, he intends to destroy all of the Jews. Almost a kind of genocide or ethnic cleansing, I guess you could say. It's debatable whether or not the king is aware of who it is that Haman is describing. Because Haman, when he describes these individuals, he says there's a certain people scattered. Now, some commentators, like Zondervan's commentary, he thinks that the king was well aware that these were the Jews and that was well understood that they were talking about the Jews, and the king was fine with it, but that maybe he was just kind of not really tricked, but just the king was like, yeah, take care of it. Whereas, again, looking strictly just at the scripture, it doesn't say that it was named, that the Jews were named specifically. And again, there were many conquered peoples that the Babylonians and the Medes and the Persians had conquered at this point. So it could have been any of them, whether or not King Xerxes or Ahasuerus was aware it was the Jews, we just don't know. But regardless, as soon as the king heard the amount of silver that Haman was going to deposit into the king's treasuries, I don't think it really would have mattered one way or the other. And we kind of talked about that last week. So, Shushan, okay, just so you know, Shushan is another word for Susa. Okay, Susa, S-U-S-A, is, there was half the time there was a capital in Susa, and then there was another half the time, other half of the year, because the winters were particularly harsh in one area of the kingdom. He would go to another part of the kingdom and reign there for 6 months. So generally speaking, he wasn't in Susa or Shushan all of the time, but there is a palace there in Shushan or Susa. But that's what Shushan is. If you're looking on a map, you're trying to find Shushan on an old map, and you can't find it, look for Susa instead. Okay, so going into chapter 4. Chapter 4 is where Mordecai, he finds out about the plan to destroy the Jews, and obviously he's upset about it, and he's going to inform the Queen Esther as well. So, starting in verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. What typically in the Old Testament, sackcloth and ashes represent what? Mourning or great distress, great emotional distress. Who else, well known in the Old Testament, also put on sackcloth and ashes? Huh? Yeah, well, David did. That's true. Wasn't even one of those thinking of. Job. Yep, Job was the one I was thinking of. When he lost his family and his belongings, he covered himself in ashes as well. But David also did it. So it's a common sign of deep emotional distress, deep sorrow, deep mourning. And so Mordecai is going into the midst of the city. He's crying out. It says he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Obviously, Mordecai's not the only one. There are some who suggest that Mordecai may have been some kind of a junior officer of the king's court. That is nowhere suggested in Scripture. Again, as far as we know, his only interest in going to the king's gate every day is to what? What was he primarily interested in, at least based on what we read? Esther. He wants to know how she's doing. He wants to make sure she's okay. And we're told that daily he went to the king's gate to see if he could hear word about how Esther was doing. So there's no suggestion of that he was actually employed by the king or that he was a member of the court in any way. And again, that particular thought process would be particularly important with regard to the king's command that everybody pay homage to Haman. So if he wasn't a member of the king's court, then perhaps that didn't apply to him. Even if it did, Mordecai is not going to offer worship to Haman. And apparently that would seem to be what he thought was happening, was there was worship involved. So verse 4, Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So obviously, the queen, I don't know how sequestered she is, but she's obviously not a part of the everyday going-ons and decisions and policies of the kingdom. And so she has no idea what's happening. All she knows is that Mordecai is at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes. So obviously something bad is happening, but she has no idea what. And so in verse 6, Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square that was in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king and make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. So notice how Esther, wherever she's at, she's not able to leave the palace, whether that was law or whatever the situation was. I'm assuming that she was not allowed to leave the palace. She couldn't go talk to Mordecai herself. So Hathach kind of has to play courier between the two of them. And so Mordecai gives her a message through him. He goes and tells her. So it is a dialogue. It is a conversation, but they're kind of playing the telephone game, I guess you could say, or Hathach just kind of playing courier between the two of them. And so in verse 10, Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. She says, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So, Mordecai sends word to Esther. Esther, here's what's happening. Here's a copy of the decree. You need to do something about this. She responds with, if I attempt to do something, he might kill me, because he hasn't called for me and I've had no opportunity to speak to him. Verse 12, so they told Mordecai Esther's words. Verse 13, Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In all of the book of Esther, what terms are never once found? God? Jehovah? Okay, there is no reference to God whatsoever in the book of Esther. And yet, is Jehovah seen in the book of Esther? All throughout. All throughout. In fact, look at the faith that Mordecai has. I know we're kind of merging into Mordecai, but we're not going to go full length into Mordecai just yet. But ask yourself the question in verse 14. How could Mordecai so confidently say that if you don't do this, God will still, even though he doesn't use God, the name of God, there will still be deliverance for the Jews? How could he say that?
There have been prophets prior to this time.
Okay.
Teaching the message.
Okay.
There will be a remnant. He will keep his people somewhere.
Okay. All right. There's always a remnant. And the prophecies spoke about the Messiah. Didn't the prophecy speak about Messiah? I mean, even prophecies before now even Moses had spoken about the Messiah. David had spoken about the Messiah. The Messiah had not yet come. And so Mordecai, knowing his scripture, knowing that God's going to preserve his people, one way or the other, he's going to make sure his people, some remnant of his people, remain. So what he tells Esther is, perhaps this is why you're in the position you're in. Perhaps God intends to use you to bring deliverance for Israel, or for Judah in this case, for the children of Israel. At this point, Israel is no more Israel proper. It's Judah. And so as a result, Mordecai's faith is such that he has complete faith in a miracle. Is he believing in a miracle? Notice what he says. Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. So it's not that the God's just going to all of a sudden snap his fingers and strike down the enemies of the Jews, but God's going to bring about a deliverer. Did God do that with the judges? Time and time and time again. And so history has taught Mordecai that God will bring about his will via someone who will be courageous enough to do his will. And again, even though Mordecai doesn't mention Jehovah, Jehovah's written all over this communication here from Mordecai to Esther. Anything through verse 14. Verse 15. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." It's interesting to me that there's no verse in between verse 14 and 15 that describes Esther's reaction or Esther's thought process. Instead, we see her reaction by what she says. And her response is such. First of all, if Mordecai didn't explain all of that and he just commanded her to do it anyway, do you think Esther would have done it? What have we already been told in chapter 3 that Esther always does? She obeys. Okay? She obeyed Mordecai when she was growing up. And when Mordecai told her to not reveal who her people are, she obeyed then. I think that if Mordecai didn't, if this wonderful verses 13 and 14 weren't there, and instead it just says, Mordecai says, you need to do this. You need to do this for your people. I think Esther will do it. I think she'd be willing to do that, to obey Mordecai, and certainly for her people as well. But instead, Mordecai doesn't just command her. He really, in a lot of ways, he delves into faith. And he talks about the fact that, listen, you're not going to be spared in the cataclysm that is coming. Now, I don't think that that's ultimately why Esther does what she does. She's not doing it to save herself. In fact, that's obvious by her response. But what Mordecai says is, God's going to use someone else to bring about deliverance. The question is, will it be you? Because perhaps this is why God has allowed you to have the position you have for this very reason. And maybe that got Esther to thinking about it. And of course, there's not a lot regarding Esther's faith that we read other than the type of actions that she commits herself to. And here when she says, if I perish, verse 16, certainly she's going to put herself on the line for Mordecai, for her people, and I would suggest that there's faith involved here in Jehovah, that if it is Jehovah's will, okay, if this is why I'm in this position, is to be available for this deliverance to the children of Israel, or to Judah, then so be it. So I think you have three motivations. I don't think she's motivated for herself whatsoever. It's about Mordecai, her people, and Jehovah. Snoop?
Well, I was going to say, if you had time to process it, though, let's see, am I going to choose to death by a man and know that that's an option going in, or do I want to be killed because God is angry? You know?
Yeah.
I'm going to choose the one by the king because I'd rather die for my people and for God's cause than because I wouldn't help my people.
Yeah.
And God is
Because I was afraid.
Yeah, or I'm just selfish.
Yeah.
You know, I'd rather die over in front of the king because I already know that. On the other hand, I'm going to die because God is upset with me, or the consequences of my selfish action.
Or inaction. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not that she had time to process all that, but I kind of break it down. What was her real choice?
Right.
Plus, when someone says to you, "Well, you're not going to escape death," I mean, she had death either way she
Yeah.
went. The end result was potentially death.
Right.
Death by the king, maybe, or for
Death
sure
by this
death.
insurrection, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, death was at her door.
Right. Yeah.
One was for sure, and one was maybe.
And so she chose the one that was selfless.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Thought I saw another hand out here somewhere. Nolan?
Sure. This question he asked at the end of verse 14, we've talked already about the plan of God and what he's going to accomplish. And we may have an understanding, God has a plan. But now, what does it mean to us personally? How does it relate? for this lady, I mean, her mindset might have been, I thought I became queen because I'm beautiful, I've got great character, I've impressed everybody, I was picked.
Mm.
You're saying maybe I'm here for a whole different reason.
Yeah.
That was nothing about me.
Right.
Or who I am.
And she seemed to still stay humble.
Yeah, absolutely.
Process. I mean, even though she was queen and the king liked her, it never showed that she was ever haughty or puffed up. Or,
Right.
Self-serving or any of that.
Right.
Today a lot of leaders or people of privilege are presented that.
Yeah, and you know what? And no, you're right. It's possible that that she could have allowed all of this to go to her head, and no, I'm here because I'm special. And I'm not saying Esther isn't special in that she served the plan of God. Certainly, everyone who serves God is special, but from the perspective of her being unique somehow, or that she is exempt from the consequences of what's going to happen to the Jews and all of that, it's almost as if Mordecai, and again, I don't think necessarily that Esther has been lulled into a false sense of security, but it's almost like Mordecai threw kind of a dash of salt on that. So don't think that you're going to be safe. Don't think your position's going to save you, because it's not.
I think the essence of the question is, we all know God has a plan. In our day and time, for the gospel to be preached, people to be saved, however you want to summarize that. But the question is, how am I going to be involved?
Yeah.
Not just, God has a plan. Okay, it's going to go on out there somewhere.
Yeah. And then I'm just going to do my own thing.
It's my part in that.
Right. Pam? Right. And ultimately, isn't that really what we all have to understand, is that no matter how much fame or power or money we may have in this world, when it comes to the plan of God, every single one of us is just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. None of us are irreplaceable. None of us are so special as if the entire plan of God revolved around one individual, which, it did, except it was Jesus Christ. And so we have to remember that in our little slice of life, that we're just a small piece. And yet, despite all of that, does God know how many hairs are on my head? Doug's head, we all know how many hairs aren't on his head. But he knows how many hairs are on my head and on Keith's head. So, knowing that God is mindful of us, and it still puts it into perspective what David says in viewing all of creation. Of course, with our telescopes and everything else, we have an even broader view than just somebody looking up at the sky to know how vast creation is. What is man that you're mindful of him? And it really does. It puts it into perspective. Snoop?
Well, I think kind of like almost, I'm going to tag on what I said about what am I doing? To ask ourselves that question in real time. Maybe I was put here in this situation at Walmart talking to this family member for a reason. Maybe I'm going to ask a question, or you cross paths with somebody that you didn't even expect to. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, am I supposed to take action in this situation? What is my role in this situation?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure we've all had it. We're like, I was in the right place at the right time for that one.
Yeah.
So I think it's a relevant question today.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a time I was maybe 17, maybe 18, I don't remember exactly, but I had gone in, I had pulled up somewhere to get a haircut, I think it was, and I got out and I noticed there was this guy in his car. He was reading the Bible, okay? And his windows were down, and I thought about saying something. And I said, well, my appointment's now, I'm going to go do my appointment. And then I decided that if that guy was still out there after my appointment, I would talk to him. Well, he wasn't. And I'll never forget that as a missed opportunity just to ask, almost as if Philip asking the eunuch, what are you reading? I wish that I could ask, hey, just, curious what what passage you're reading or what chapter you're reading, whatever, and if it would have brought about anything. And so those opportunities that we have, they may not always be around. Just in a period of 30 minutes, that opportunity passed by, and I didn't get a chance to talk to that guy. And I'll never forget that. And that's just one of those things that, you ask yourself the question, what am I doing? And that's an opportunity that presented itself perfectly. And, I'm not comparing myself to Philip, but I mean, it was looking back on it, it was like, a guy sitting in his car reading a Bible. How much closer to the Ethiopian eunuch can you get? And I didn't take that opportunity.
Here's Esther's flaw. For all the good things we've noted about her, verse 16, she's going to break the law.
Yeah.
She does it with forethought.
Premeditatedly. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, I'm going to break the law.
Yeah. You're right. And speaking of that, when she asks or tells Mordecai, have everybody in Shushan fast, what typically associates fasting in both the Old and New Testament? Prayer. Even though prayer isn't mentioned, almost every commentary suggests that when she says to fast, it's with the purpose and the thought of praying for success, praying for the king to do something about the situation, to fast. In fact, even her and her maids, verse 16, are going to do the same thing. And even though she doesn't specifically mention prayer, when the Jews fasted, generally it was accompanied by prayer. I think that's an interesting point to make there. All right, verse 17. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So everybody's praying, everybody's fasting. And so Esther, and we're not going to read all of this because Esther plans this banquet. Okay, she goes in, we see in verse 1, she stands in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, king sitting on his royal throne. In verse 2, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So we see how that, instead of putting her to death, even though it was against the law for her to come unsummoned, she found favor in his sight, as has been the case this whole time. And so then Esther is able to come and talk to him. She invites him and who else to a banquet? Haman. Yeah. The reason why her people are in this situation. What is your request, he asks in verse 3. Verse 4, please come to a banquet that I've prepared for you. And so the king comes and they dine. And in verse 6, Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Verse 7, Esther says, my petition and request is this. If I found favor in your sight, why don't you come again to another banquet that I'm going to have for you tomorrow? So there's 2 banquets that she has planned. Certainly the fact that he's drinking wine, okay, that's, some make a big deal that she's getting him drunk. I don't believe that's the case. She is buttering him up, okay, I would say that she is seeking to garner even more favor so that when she ultimately makes her request, he's in the best possible mood that she can get him in. Okay, I would say that. I don't think that's manipulation. I think it's just attempting to curry favor with him so that when she makes the request, he's in a state of mind that is more receptive to it. So, starting in verse 9, we see Haman's reaction not only to this first banquet, but now being invited to the second. I mean, he thinks he's the bee's knees here. He says, so Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself, went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. Verse 12, and in addition to that, besides Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am invited by her again along with the king. Verse 13, yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. when we talk about Haman, all right, and we talk a little bit about his character before, we know this guy's got an ego, okay? But just how delicate is this ego? Okay, how superficial is this ego? He goes and he talks about all of the great things he's got going for him. And does he have a lot going for him? You would think one Jew sitting out the king's gate refusing to bow to him wouldn't be that big of a deal. But for Haman, everybody has to love him. And if one does not, then it's dark, cloudy, stormy skies all over. Despite all of the great things going, yet it avails me nothing. Does this sound like a temper tantrum to you? I mean, the only thing missing is Ahab wailing around on his bed because he didn't get his vineyard that he wanted. All right? It's the only really thing missing. It's similar in respect to the fact that it's like he's pouting. Okay? Yeah, kind of like the prodigal son's older brother, yeah. He's pouting because he doesn't have every possible thing that he could want. He wants to see Mordecai bow and pay him homage. And Mordecai won't do it. And it infuriates Haman to no end. Now, why? Why is he so fixated on Mordecai? I don't know. It's almost like one of those things you almost wish you could go back and ask, why is this such a big deal to you? Why is it such a big deal you're going to commit genocide and kill all of his people, including him? It seems a bit of an overreaction, but it shows, remember, what position was Haman? Second to the king, we're told. He was promoted second to the king. He is the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Out of, 122 provinces or something like that? And this one man, Mordecai, refuses to bow down and pay homage. And it just suggests the fragility of this man's ego, his self-value. He takes that from what other people, the type of appreciation and devotion that other people show him. That all these wonderful things that he has going, those don't mean anything if Mordecai continues to not pay me homage. And it's just an incredibly human, but incredibly fallibly human type of mindset. Snoop?
Yeah, it reminds me too, well, first off, Mordecai's trying to control, not Mordecai, Haman's trying to control Mordecai.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when we look at modern day behavior, even amongst our brothers and sisters in Christ, you will hear of very petty things that people can't look. And if you think about it, Haman's spending all this time thinking about Mordecai. Mordecai's not thinking about Haman.
No.
Mordecai is thinking about what's good for his people.
Right.
So here you have this guy that's hyper-focusing on one person with intent to harm, and this other person isn't thinking at all about them. And that happens in today's society, and I use the words, if I give someone that three negative things to me and I dwell on it, I'm giving my power to them.
Yeah.
Mordecai didn't give any of his power. And when you think about it, Haman was like a giant and Mordecai was less than David.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Haman was Goliath and Mordecai was David.
Mordecai was living rent-free in a mansion inside the head of Haman, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah.
And you think about this feud between Mordecai and Haman, a rivalry. It wasn't a feud and it wasn't a rivalry. It takes two to have a feud. It takes two to have a rivalry. Mordecai wasn't involved. This is all up in Haman's head. This was not disrespect on Mordecai's part. And maybe if Haman had taken the time just to ask Mordecai, maybe talk to him, maybe sit down and learn why is Mordecai, that it has nothing to do with you personally. It's that, I serve Jehovah, and only Jehovah will I bow down in worship to. Maybe it wouldn't have been a big deal. It still would have been a big deal, because Haman is the way he is.
Talks about, to me, I read a lot of anger
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
And how irrational we are when we get.
That's true.
And
Be angry, but sin not, Paul told the Ephesians. Yeah. This is anger taking control. Ben?
If you go back to the third chapter, Haman didn't even notice. It didn't work out with the bowing until the servants brought
Until they pointed it out to him. What are you going to do about it?
It was powerful enough that there was enough people bowing and scraping, he didn't even notice.
He didn't even notice.
And he did it day after day.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah, that's a great point. That it wasn't until other people pointed it out that it became a thing. That's true. Agitators. Yeah, what are you going to do about it? Let's see Mordecai get in trouble here. Yeah, pot stirs. All right, so verse 14, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. And of course, we talked last week, this term gallows, it's not really so much as a means of hanging, it's a means of impaling. And making it 50 cubits high, it has what significance? 50 cubits, I mean, at 18 inches a cubit, that's a high impaling post. A lot of people can see it. For all the world to see that this is what happens when you don't bow down to me. Okay? And then you can go on, happy as can be, on to your banquet. All right, so chapter 6 is a key chapter dealing with Mordecai. All right, so we're going to skip chapter 6 for now. We're going to go to chapter 7, and we're going to see how that Esther, at the second banquet now, she has Haman and the king there. The king asks her again, this is the third time that he's asked this question, what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, and it shall be done. And then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? This suggests to me that even if way back when because there was a period of time passing between chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. If indeed King was aware that the request of Haman included the destruction of the Jews, it would seem to have gone by the wayside at this point. Or at the very least, the king didn't put 2 and 2 together. Okay, she doesn't specifically mention the fact that she is of the Jews, but they're gonna put that together when it's Haman's declaration that is at the heart of this thing. But it seems to me to fit better that the king didn't know it was specifically the Jews. And of course, we know that Esther had never revealed who her people were. Okay, so the king didn't know that she was of the Jews. And so in verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Was Haman wicked? Yeah, he's wicked. All right, he's a bad dude. He's not the type of person you want to know. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And then we see starting in verse 7, the king gets furious. He walks out for a little bit. This is his second in command. This is his right hand. So he's going to consider his next action, which is saying something. And then we'll see how that turns out for Haman. So we're going to stop here at verse 6. And then, Lord willing, next Wednesday night, we'll finish up with Esther. And then we'll talk about Mordecai. Lord willing, we'll have everything wrapped up next week so that we can move on. All right, everybody. Thanks for the thoughts and comments.